Hello, Automating Success followers. Today I have Rui on the show. He is the current Chief Technology Officer at Expedock. Did I say that right, actually? I should
You
have asked
did.
you that before you got on the show. Good. Uh, so
You got it.
so it, it Expedock, and it's a company that's leading the AI revolution in supply chain, applying it to many of the largest logistics businesses worldwide. And before that, he also worked at applying computer vision to healthcare use cases. He has a vast knowledge of experience in engineering at multiple large technical companies. Just to kind of go down a little bit, um, he was a researcher for Stanford Machine Learning, worked with Professor Andrew NG's lab on problems at the intersection of healthcare and artificial intelligence. They solved problems in cancer diagnosis and global health using deep learning, computer vision, and Q learning. Prior to that, he also interned as a software engineer at Stripe from September 2018 to December 2018, and at Airbnb, which I use a lot of actually, in 2018 also. Just kind of going down the list, he has a master's degree in artificial intelligence from Stanford. He has a bachelor's in computer science from Stanford also. Let's see. There's a lot here, so I'm kind of skimming. So hopefully you don't mind
Yeah,
this,
that's all
Rui.
right. We don't have to go
But
through all of it.
yeah, but yeah, he published ML Researcher with Professor Andrews' group. So yeah, so I mean, I'm going to get into it here with him. He has a great background. This is Automating Success, and this is a guest I'm really excited to have on the show. I this all this AI, machine learning type of guests that you really intrigue me, Rui. I have some ideas in this myself for what I'm doing right now. Maybe after the show, you and I can collaborate. You give me some ideas, but um, did I miss anything?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything there. Really happy and excited to be here and have the discussion with you.
Awesome. So, I'm just going to get into some questions here. In your opinion, how can AI help make supply chains more efficient? I mean, obviously that's what you're working on right now. So, what is it that you're passionate about, and how is that helping efficiency?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a really kind of interesting and technical and in-depth question. So I'll try to cover it sort of as best I can, maybe like a 2-minute summary or something like that.
Can take as
So
long as.
it's okay, or maybe longer than 2-minute
Yeah,
summary.
exactly.
So the global supply chain is really what it is it's a network, right? So it's a bunch of businesses, kind of like the internet, how the internet coordinates to move data across borders. You watch a YouTube video, that server is somewhere in Virginia or something like that. It goes kind of across a bunch of hops, and like across the US and ends up on your computer. Supply chain is basically that. Except it's I guess the tech pundits would call it atoms instead of bits, right? So you're moving physical goods, you're not moving kind of like packets or something like that. But the fundamental kind of infrastructure behind it is actually quite similar. Um, Instead of a server, in my world or in the computer world, you have like a business that maybe makes coffee beans or something like that. They go onto a boat with a carrier, that gets cleared through customs on, the manufacturer, the supply side country, that moves across the ocean, gets imported maybe into the US or somewhere else where those things get processed, loaded onto containers, trucks, moved to warehouses and kind of transported all the way to sort of like a corner convenience store, an example of coffee. So, what you've got here is you've got this sort of, the point is you've got this massively complex infrastructure of businesses. And the hypothesis behind kind of Expedock is that we can sort of use artificial intelligence to sort of make this process of moving goods at a high scale a lot more efficient than it's been done. So fundamentally, like how this works has primarily been the same in the past like 160 years. Like, I mean, now people are using emails and stuff like that, but really what it is it's people talking to each other, calling each other, saying, hey, my containers are coming in at this point in time, or like, this is the data that's needed here, or, we got to enter this with the US government or something like that to clear this like shipment of cell phones or whatever, right? And really like where we see the kind of largest opportunity in sort of like using artificial intelligence in supply chain is kind of deriving it from data, right? And like using the kind of all the unstructured communications and data, structuring that with AI in terms of like using kind of computer vision techniques, natural language processing techniques, which are sort of, you've seen maybe with some of these larger language models like ChatGPT coming out is like NLP. And really what we do is we take those, we structure the data, and then we use that data to both like run shipments more efficiently and then like run the businesses that we work with help them kind of get transparency on how their operations are going, help them provide visibility to the other businesses in that kind of network who they're working with. So people don't have to just kind of like email back and forth or lose shipments or something like that. And that's kind of like the sort of opening bridge that we see is kind of the automation, I guess, beachhead into supply chain, although it's certainly not the extent of how AI is going to be used in the next 20, 25 years.
So, I think, and this is what people I think constantly question end users, like someone like yourself, you understand exactly how it works. But I think one of the hurdle in our space is the check and balance, right? If somebody's going to trust AI to do all this stuff people did, how do you guys do implementation? I'm assuming you do something in parallel. You want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, trust is a huge problem, right? I mean, not only do you have kind of trust in terms of like, okay, we don't know if this output is good, but it's very high consequence for our industry specifically because, like, I mean, imagine your AI says, okay, you're shipping 10,000 iPhones, not 100,000 iPhones. That's a very big problem for a business. And
Yes.
like, you could lose a deal with Apple, put you under, something like that. Obviously, that's a little bit exaggerated, but you can see the importance of sort of the quality of data and quality of output. So there's a couple of main things that we do and that I've seen kind of more broadly across the industry be done. So first of all, I think model explainability is a big thing. And the concept of model explainability is just like, okay, you've got your AI model, right? You have your ChatGPT or you have your whatever. You have to understand kind of why it makes the predictions that it does. And you can do this through sort of a variety of techniques and visualizations. And we basically, for us to build trust with our customers, we basically just provide those visualizations. And we say, hey, this is what our AI output for this document or this email or this piece of data. Like, this is probably why it output this, or like, this is what it paid attention to, which why it thinks, this is an invoice number. And it can see that kind of improve, it can see it both understand why it makes the decisions. And then also the improvement over time is an important part, right? Like as you get more data, as you get more training data and with AI in general, like your things start performing better, or your models start performing better. So that's kind of another thing to build trust. The last thing I think is like oftentimes I think people are willing to, even in an industry like supply chain where it's very traditional, people see the kind of promise of artificial intelligence and are willing to experiment with it. And I think that like a lot of the trust comes through honestly just having it work for the business. Like you can say as much as you want around like, hey, this is going to work or this is great, but like when you kind of have the sort of implementation on the ground running and it's driving success, like that is by far the sort of biggest driver of trust in the businesses that we service.
So when you guys have a customer, do they usually, I mean, I'm assuming, I'm just trying to put myself in the position of being a customer. Do they usually say, okay, we'll give you 10% of the workload? Do they give you a percentage first and you work into the full workload? And if so, what's the percentage of workload you guys actually cover right now and what you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, as you pointed out, the processes are very complex, right? There's 50 different things that have to go right that can get automated for like a certain shipment or something like that, right? So
Yep.
generally, what we do is we pilot with maybe one or two vendors So we work with 3PLs and shippers, and they have different vendors, right? So if you're a 3PL, the 3PL is a third party logistics company, freight forwarder, helps move the containers for a shipper. You might have Joe's Plants or something like that as your customer, and you might have like uh, Bob's water bottles and 100 of these guys, right? And you're moving all those shipments across the world. So what we do generally is we roll out with kind of like a subset of them. So they say, okay, look, we think we think this technology is great. We want to pilot it. Like, let's start with Joe's Plants only, right? And then like if that goes really well, we'd be happy to expand into Bob's water bottles and 100 other vendors and kind of scale up through that. That is challenging for both the business and for us. I mean, it's necessary because I think if you put everything through like a new piece of technology, there's always the chance for failure or miscommunications or like misuse of it. So the staggered rollout is certainly important to success. But it is also necessary.
So how is it affecting traditional supply chain process? I mean, is it getting used right now as like assisting in demand, right? I'm assuming right now, is that the spot you're in, or is it actually more, is it growing more than I would even realize?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say that there's a couple of things here. So first of all, I mean, with supply chains, the major story right now, I don't know if you follow it at all, but the major story in kind of this business model right now is, rates for containers are really high for a long time, right? Like you could charge a ton of money for it. And you had all these kind of 3PLs charging thousands and thousands of dollars for a container, and like their margins were pretty good, right? So it was a lot of kind of focus on growth, expansion, like getting market share, getting as many containers as possible, just because it was so profitable. Today, now the main focus around, and like that was, I guess, to your point, where you have this sort of demands prediction for artificial intelligence, right? Like a lot of the AI applications were around like, hey, who should we target next? Who's similar to this, right? Like let's group these businesses together, see if we can get containers from this guy, or say like, oh, we're moving these, like how much can we move in this amount of time, with kind of like just general forecasting and modeling. Now it's really shifted to kind of like a cost savings model, because the rates have kind of imploded from a kind of containerization perspective. There's been a good amount of pain in terms of like layoffs, cost cutting, stuff like that. And so people are really interested in sort of automation, as in not to replace humans necessarily, but to kind of have people do more with less. Which is sort of our philosophy. It's sort of like augmentation versus automation, right? A lot of it right now is saying like, hey, you had a whole department that was like processing these shipments. Unfortunately, we had to kind of cut costs on some of this, so you have less resources than usual. How can we use technology to kind of help people become sort of more efficient than ever before, and help run our business in a more efficient way to survive in this kind of new macroeconomic climate?
Yeah, I think this is the constant conversation every time I have somebody on. Automating success is, you know, people say, I feel like you were very quick to say it's not replacing people, it's kind of doing it differently and this and that. And I always think it's crazy because the amount of guests that I have on the show, they're all people. So people are the ones doing the automation, and they're the brains behind the automation. So I just always like to point that out, is that automation does bring jobs um, to the world, and it brings usually higher paying jobs, and it's a problem solver. Most things that we're automating are actually problems that industries are facing, or that they're pressured with, right? So I just want to kind of throw that in there and see if that's what got you guys started in the first place. Because at the end of the day, anything that's being automated, someone had to identify there was a need for it in the space. So how did you guys identify that need in the first place?
That's a
Who had the vision to say, hey, we should get into this?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, like absolutely agree with you around kind of the sort of like helping humans do higher leverage type work versus kind of automation. The biggest kind of feedback that we get from our largest customers is they're like, the best thing about this product is like, now my people can actually do what matters for this company, right? Like they can go out, they can close new business, they can get new containers in, they don't have to spend like, 20 hours a week like keying in documents or data entry or something like that. It's ridiculous, right? Like, of
Yeah.
course, everyone wants to be doing the kind of the high leverage things, and I think that's what we're trying to enable. Anyway, in terms of what where the idea came from, it is kind of idiosyncratic, I guess, as a business model. The biggest thing I think was it was from my co-founders mostly. So the founding story is that I knew my co-founders kind of from college. One of them actually dropped out of school to work for a 3PL company for a while, which is a very odd thing to do, but ended up kind of working out for him. The other one actually had done a company before, kind of doing importing from Asia to the US. So they had sort of a very deep understanding of supply chain processes. And the impetus to kind of begin the business is like my coworker, or my co-founder who dropped out of school was at the forwarder for a few years, and was like, hey, a lot of this stuff doesn't really make sense in kind of today's world to be going on, right? There's just so many operational inefficiencies happening here, that things are taking way longer than they should have to. It's a real opportunity for technology to improve here. And, the market is big enough that like you could probably make a pretty successful business selling this to, tens or hundreds of thousands of these businesses worldwide, because the supply chain's so big. I came in a little bit later after that, where they were like, hey, we think this is a potential business model opportunity here to kind of like grow, or kind of like, approach this market and provide automation here. And I was interested because, first of all, I felt that it was a very large kind of problem, and fundamental problem towards basically everything around us, right? Like 95% of everything you see around you is shipped in a container, and you can make that a
Yeah,
lot more efficient.
very
Like that
true.
improves everyone's quality of life, right? And then the second thing I think is that like it's, yeah, I mean, I was passionate about sort of automation in general. I was passionate about kind of making people more productive, and I felt that this was a great way to do it.
Yeah, that's great. So, have you guys been growing from the original founder, the original idea? Has the growth curve been, you know, kind of right on the trajectory you thought? Has it been growing quicker than you thought? Like, what's the adoption been on this for you guys?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like these things never shake out like you want them to, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Or maybe as you expect to. I
yeah,
think that the growth curve has been pretty, I mean, I would say it's grown pretty quickly, although in like more of a linear fashion. Like we haven't gone from like, 3 people to 50 in like 6 months or something like that.
yeah,
Basically the main things that we're looking at right now is like we're getting into kind of solving the problems at scale for the largest businesses in the world that are handling this stuff. And that's kind of what's driving a large sort of part of our growth. The sales cycles for going after traditional businesses like this, I mean, they're justifiably cautious a lot of the time with technology, because obviously it's a core business process. Like you have to get things right, and so the sort of cycle takes a little bit longer than a fast-moving, high-flying tech startup would maybe want sometimes. But overall, I would say that like things have been within the kind of bounds of reasonability. It hasn't been too much of a crazy takeoff, but also it's been growing quickly, and we've been adopting to sort of a lot of very large businesses and helping them solve their processes kind of in the past few years or so since starting.
So one of the things I've found since I got in automation, and I just wonder, I mean, I'm automating like physical like systems, right? So it's kind of a little different space, but still relevant to the question. I've found that every time I work with one of the really big companies, they they're like, "Oh, you're automating. We can give you all this data, and because we're going to give you this data, you're going to give us this good price." And da da da. And I just wonder, are you guys having any better luck with that? I mean, and by the way, if you don't want to comment to this, because if I don't want you to get in any hot water with your big customers, but what I found was, and I wonder if you guys have ventured into the space, the middle market customers are actually the customers that need the problem solved more, and they seem more willing to pay for it. Are you guys seeing that same type of parallel?
Actually, not as much. I mean, I think that, so. There's the thing with us is like there's demand across the market, right? The problem like around removing manual work applies for anyone in the supply chain. I would
Okay.
say that like what we're seeing kind of upmarket, we're seeing the opposite of that. Upmarket, we're seeing the problems at a very high scale, right? If you're a mid market forwarder, you may be processing, I don't know, 5,000 shipments a year. Each of those has 5 documents approach to it, which is not small, but like and the largest ones are doing millions, right? Like it's
Yeah,
like not even in the
it's more manageable. It's easier to
exactly.
manage probably with the team they have. Yeah.
Yeah, and then for the mid market, actually, we're seeing use cases, other kind of interests around like applying data and AI towards better visibility around container tracking, better sort of user experiences with the businesses that they interface with, like ability to kind of do predictive analytics around sort of their shipments, saying like, hey, is this going to show up? Are there potential delays here? Stuff like that. Weirdly enough, the big guys have already built this stuff out, right? Because they have IT teams and people who are like dedicated, sort of focused on this. No one's just kind of cracked the sort of longer tail with it. So yeah. Anyway, overall, we're seeing kind of weirdly the opposite of, of sort of what you're seeing, where the automation is more applicable kind of upmarket, and then sort of the usage of data and AI versus the automation itself. I mean, automation is still useful, but like in conjunction with these other use cases is what you see kind of down market.
Awesome. No, I'm glad I asked the question because this is always, it's one of the reasons I do the podcast. I'm always intrigued at, kind of the different spaces and maybe if things are different. So apparently it is a little. Um, you brought up, some of the if there's any trepidation, it's because the risks. So what would the risks be? Just mishandling a shipment? Like what are the risks they're concerned about?
Yeah, the major risks that we generally see are kind of fall in a few categories. First one, security. Obviously, like we're processing data, like this data may be sensitive or proprietary for customers, like not our customers, but their customers' information, which oftentimes they care more about, because obviously
Yep.
you can't provide sort of a leak from that. So we have to take security very seriously. We have kind of like extensively and heavily invested into like compliance processes, like SOC 2, like encryption, all this stuff, making sure the data is totally secure. Nothing gets touched by someone who shouldn't have access to it. Second thing from a business perspective is what you talked about briefly there, which is basically messing up a shipment. So it's pretty complicated because again, I'm telling you, there's 20 processes and each can go wrong in different ways. But like if it really boils down to it, the major risk that you get in terms of rolling something out like this is screwing up an invoice or a shipment or missing details or something like that. So accuracy becomes really, really high in importance for these guys, for our customers. And that is something that we basically try to kind of mitigate as a concern in a few ways. I mean, the first one, similar to like model explainability, you have to provide visibility, right? We have to say, hey, look, this is our accuracy rate here. If you flag a mistake, that goes in like a dashboard or something like that. You can track the mistakes over time. Like we obviously shoot for a super, super low rate here. Because I mean, humans who are doing this normally would make mistakes too. So 0% is not realistic, but like the ability to track that and understand, transparently how that's going is really important. And then the second thing I think is you just have to be able to kind of UA this stuff. So if it's highly sensitive, we put a human in the loop in to review AI output. which is again this kind of augmentation side of things, either on the customer side or on our side, for things that where it's like, if you mess up a decimal point or something like that, it's an issue. You can implement processes for sort of a very high accuracy SLA. You can have transparency, and then on top of that, I think, yeah, those are probably the major things.
So I'm assuming you guys are mainly focused on like ocean freight, like continent to continent. You're not doing any last mile stuff. I'm assuming.
Yeah, we do ocean, we do air, we do some cross border stuff, but it's just kind of going into it now with customs brokerage and stuff like that. Yeah, we don't do as much last mile stuff. Although I think in domestic trucking, there's definitely a market for this. I've seen companies in it before doing similar stuff. We just decided to go with ocean because that's where we knew there was a problem for the
Yeah,
initial customer base.
yeah. I just myself just started doing some ocean freight because I import systems from the UK now,
Oh
and
yeah, good luck.
so yeah. Well, and so you brought up the decrease in freight price. Um, why do you think that is? I mean, was it? I mean, because it seemed to me it skyrocketed during COVID, right? And now I mean, I have seen it is coming down a little bit myself. Is that just it? Is there less international freight going on, or what's going on in that industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think generally with prices, they're driven by supply and demand, right? And here is not really an exception. I think that during COVID, you had like massive shocks to the system where like you couldn't get containers out I mean, you saw there was news articles about like, hey, the Port of LA has thing, going 20 miles into the ocean. There's boats with containers here, right? Like you can't get them. So supply like plummets from just people not going into the office, things breaking down. I mean, I saw some forwarders who they didn't have laptops like for their employees or something like that, so they couldn't work when there was a lockdown, and they just like shut down tons of boats. But I think that basically was probably what drove most of it, where it was like an extremely constricted supply, right? Massive shock in terms of the pandemic, where it's like, okay, all these businesses now can't move their containers, so no one can get a container. So the ones that you can get, who can move, can profit kind of very, very handsomely from this. But then, as things have kind of eased up, as we've sort of gotten through the initial sort of bottleneck of supply chain issues and stuff like that, I think you're seeing kind of supply match up again with demand, which means that prices are going to go down. I don't think people are shipping necessarily like way more or way less on the demand end. Like I think it's like relative. I mean, it's probably like a little bit different, but it's not like, a huge shock like there was with supply and during kind of the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah, great answer. So, kind of to shift gears a little bit. So, how has generative AI changed the equation for AI adoption use um, with speed across the logistics industry?
Yeah, generative AI. I mean, that's the big buzzword now. Everyone's talking about it. I think it's done a couple of things. I mean, I think first of all, it's like helped people. I mean, just from a macro perspective, it's helped people understand what AI can do, right? I think like, if you look at this like 5 to 8 years ago, it was definitely in supply chain. It was this very kind of esoteric concept, right? Like maybe some of the forward thinkers or early adopters were starting to look at it. There was some kind of general consensus of like, okay, maybe there's something here. But now that you have kind of this massive sort of explosion of these language models and ChatGPT and all this stuff, people are like, oh, okay, we see that this could be like a real sort of thing for our business. I think there was a survey that went out, a few months ago, and like it was like 75% of CEOs, hey, that generative AI is a top priority for like adopting in their business, and supply chain is no exception for this. Second thing I think is, in terms of use cases and rollout on this, you're starting to see a lot of this get applied at these businesses. So a lot of supply chain is kind of, customer experience, customer success. And like there are use cases where it's like, okay, if you can build a generative AI enabled kind of control tower for your business, or operating system software for your business that's kind of powered by sort of AI, generative AI on top of your data, that can retrieve from your data. That's really powerful. And I think I think maybe Flexport is working on something like that, but I'm not actually sure. and I think other businesses are starting to adopt that and kind of ask us about that as well, right? So I go into these meetings, and every single meeting I get asked like, well, how are you guys going to put generative AI in your products? And it's like, okay, we're working on it. Like it's a lot of use cases here, but it's certainly exciting.
So, when you're using AI for shipping, let's say there's a problem, right? How I mean, how does a human being intercept all the automatic things taking place um, in real time and kind of put a pause on the AI and interject uh, the human element and then let the AI take back over? Like, I mean, I don't do what you do, but I'm assuming that that's got to be something you have built in, and I'm assuming it's a question listeners would have. So
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things here. So the first one you have to do is break down by problem type, right? So there are some types of problems where like your AI can be 90% accurate or 80% accurate, like for document or email extraction or something like that. And there are some types of problems where it's going to be 100% accurate all the time because it's algorithmic based or something like that, right? So if it's based off of like, okay, we just have to match this thing to this thing and then like show up with this set of rules or something like that, or make this kind of decision set of decisions in a decision tree, like you don't necessarily have to have a human intervene in that ever. And so that's something that you can kind of take out of the equation. For the stuff that's less accurate, there's a couple things you can do. A lot of AI models today have confidence scoring. So we do something called thresholding, where basically, the AI itself can say, I think this says 10,000 iPhones, but I'm 55% confident or something like that, right? And so if the AI says it's 55% confident, our system says like, hey, wait a minute, like that's not that's not very confident, right? Like
yeah,
we
hit
should
hit
probably
hit
have
the
a yeah.
pause button.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like, wait a
exactly.
minute, like before you ship this shipment of maybe iPhones, like hit the pause button, have a human come check in, understand if that works. But if it says, I'm 98%, 99% confident, and it's less sensitive of like a field or something like that, we say, okay, this makes sense. We can just continue processing.
Well, and I suppose, so I look at stuff like this too. Okay, so your risk factor of, okay, let's say it makes a wrong decision because of its confidence scale. I mean, for myself, as someone that uses automation daily, uh, the risk is usually or the reward outweighs the risk, right? So in that one situation where something ships that shouldn't have, there's not anything that says it can't be sent back or changed, right? So I'm sure that's stuff you guys have to sell into. Do most people see that? I'm assuming the people making decisions to move to this product with you, they're already well aware of the mishaps from human beings in the first place, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a major buying decision, right? It's like, okay, help my humans become less mistake prone, like become more efficient, leverage them towards higher leverage type work. That's a big part of it. And then I think that like, yeah, I mean, for super sensitive stuff, like you still always have the human element, right? Like if it's like, this is a make or break decision for the client or the business or something like that, like you're going to have the AI process it, but like before it goes into like the US government or the final thing, right? It's like, okay, last check here, like we did everything here. We don't have to key in kind of all this data, but have a human come look at it and then make the final call for that.
So, where do you guys plan to go? I mean, like from where you're at now to where you guys want to be, um, what do you think you're going to have, how much work is ahead of you and how are you going to get there? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's an ocean of work ahead of us, and not just because we're an ocean freight, terrible fun, but
Yeah. Yeah. But I
I
was
think, yeah.
thinking, I actually didn't think it was so terrible. I liked it.
Okay.
So,
No, thank
yeah.
you. At least I got one fan. Yeah, a couple of major things though. First up, I think is like we're continuing our kind of automation expansion use cases. So we've primarily started out in ocean freight, as we talked about a little bit before on this call. And we're kind of moving into other kind of adjacent supply chain markets that have similar problems, but we just haven't targeted yet, right? So there's like domestic trucking, there's customs brokerage, there's air freight, there's rail freight, there's cross border trade, there's 50 different things here. And they all face kind of related types of problems. I mean, it's not exactly the same, having an air shipment versus an ocean shipment because you've got different timelines and, there's different fields and documents and stuff like that. But it's kind of like a generally similar process moving containers across borders. So that's one thing that we're looking at. The next thing I would say we're looking at is like we're really starting to look at like I call it like how we build on top of a data bedrock almost, right? So we look at our kind of all the data that we've captured from our customers as sort of like this bedrock for building successful kind of AI driven products on top of, right? So you have all this data around like your invoices or your shipments and stuff like that. And then you can start looking at like, hey, can we build like visibility layers on top of this, right? Like, can we like track your shipments in real time after we've entered the data and show that to your customers? Like, can we understand like which of your vendors are delinquent or not paying you on time, right? Like, can we start using this data to be like, historically, like from a trend perspective, like how is this going? And then can we apply AI to kind of perform predictive analytics on this and then sort of sell that back, I guess, to the businesses or deliver that to the businesses and say like, hey, this is like, we know you like us for like processing this data, eliminating this work, but like, look at all you can do with kind of the data that we're getting. And we think that like, that's super important from kind of just like a stickiness perspective where we become super valuable to these businesses in kind of every facet of things, not just automating and stuff like that. And B, I think it's kind of a natural use case of sort of like, in automation, it's for a business like this, when you're collecting tons of data, like a lot of use cases on top of it are going to arise. And you'll probably see this pattern across kind of many different industries.
Awesome. Um, so now is going to be the part of the show where I kind of get more into what got you into this, right? So not the business itself. So You have a master's from Stanford. What got you into that space in the first place? It was as you're sitting in high school, hanging out with your buddies. What made you realize this is what I want to do with my life?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that my path to it is a little bit circuitous, I guess, for lack of a better word. There's a couple of things. So kind of in high school, I was actually not as much. I can start with my background from there. I wasn't as much into kind of computers, science, automation, AI stuff in general. I was more about like math, interested in kind of mathy, physicsy type things. And I was like, maybe I'll be a scientist. I don't really know what I want to do with my life, right? Come out to Stanford. And I think the first sort of shift there was like seeing kind of the amazing things that people were doing with technology in Silicon Valley, right? Like I come there, I grew up on the East Coast. So it was a lot more kind of finance type stuff. Came out like technology a lot more after I kind of came out to the West Coast, and then realized that like, okay, this is something that I think can impact sort of a lot of areas of the world, right, and be meaningful to have me spend my time doing. So I got a little bit more into computer science from there. You listed my background in pretty extensive detail earlier, but so I'll spare everyone of kind of looking through that again. But basically, started that and then started interning at kind of some larger tech companies. I wanted to do kind of larger companies because they were, I felt like I could learn kind of world-class engineering practices from kind of the best people. And while I was there, kind of started seeing a pattern, I guess, where sort of our automation and artificial intelligence was kind of eating everything, basically, right? Like I would go to these jobs, and they would say like, okay, look, we're in payments at Stripe, right? Like big payment processor kind of around the world. They're like, our biggest things and biggest initiatives right now are around artificial intelligence for fraud detection and stuff like this. And we're spinning up a whole team and there's a lot of stuff here. And then, I go to work for a database company out of college. And their big thing is like, okay, artificial intelligence is driving databases, right? Like this is, going to be how all these databases are built out. And I was like, okay, there's something here, right? There's something here in terms of like, this is like a fundamental kind of, I think Andrew Ng, who I worked for, calls it like a fourth industrial revolution almost, where he's like, look, automation, AI, this is going to be in everything that you see, kind of like electricity, right? Like not only is there going to be like a computer or like a smartwatch or something like that powered by electricity, it's going to get powered by artificial intelligence as well. And so how I mostly got interested into it was like kind of so anyway, had the sort of mathy background that it was interesting from like a technical and academic standpoint. And then I saw the kind of impact it was having in the world, working at, across many different types of industries. And that's sort of why I got interested into the field in general.
So that's yeah, it's always like interesting. So you got into it pretty quick. I can see the parallel how you went from math to where you're at. So was learning it, did it come easy for you? Was it more difficult than you thought it'd be once you made the decision to do it? Like kind of going to that.
Yeah, I think it was I wouldn't say it was easy. I mean, it's a very complicated field to
Yeah.
study, right? Like, I had a grad degree in it for a reason. But I would say that the math background certainly helped. The computer science background certainly helps. I mean, I think, my advice, I guess, to anyone kind of picking up on it right now is like definitely have like at least a college level math background. If you want to do like technical implementation of these models and stuff, I think to apply it to these industries, you don't necessarily need it because you can use off the shelf tooling and stuff like that. But if you want to go out and like build your own stuff, having a really solid math background and computer science background are the two key things here. And then just like experimenting and trying out with stuff is what's important, right? Like if you're able to build this stuff and like follow tutorials and all that, I think that's a great way to learn it.
So if a guy like me that doesn't have that background had an AI idea that he wanted to build out himself, uh, how do I find people like you that are not already tied up in another endeavor?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's supply and demand, right? So there's not a big supply, a lot of demand for these people, so it's difficult. I'd say there's a few things you can do. I think one is you don't necessarily need someone who's super research oriented for a lot of ideas because a lot of companies are realizing that there's a market for artificial intelligence in general and they're providing the kind of model layer itself, right? And then it's like, okay, I can just use Google's models or whatever and use computer vision to like find manufacturing defects through that technology or like have someone who's a little bit less technically sophisticated do it, which is a totally valid way to succeed for a lot of problem use cases. If you want someone who's a little bit more deeply technical, I would say that like honestly, just spending time where these people hang out is good. I mean, I think that there's like artificial intelligence hackathons where people have interesting ideas. A lot of those people are kind of very entrepreneurial, interested in starting stuff, which is why they're at the hackathon building things, but aren't necessarily tied up in companies or something like that. I think that like there's a lot of people also too from larger companies or other jobs who are realizing this is like a pretty big technical shift and are interested in getting into the sort of entrepreneurial space. So reaching out to those type of people, I think, is pretty important. And then I would say that like overall, overall, like you don't necessarily need a person with like a deep research background or a math background to solve a lot of problems in automation and AI. I think it shouldn't scare people off. I think it scares some people off, and it's really like not as high a bar as people think. But if you do, for whatever reason, feel like you absolutely need that, I would just suggest going where they are, talking to them, finding people who are excited in business and trying to convince them to join you.
Yeah, no, well, so for me, I'm an idea guy, and I own several businesses already. So a lot of my AI ideas fuel my business itself. But I'm always nervous, not necessarily to work with the wrong people, but end up in the wrong platform that lets my idea just out into the open, like open space. So it's like I'm always nervous of these AI models. Like people are like, oh, just you could put that into Chat GPT and you could do this and you do that. But I'm like, yeah, but then what happens, right? Can you speak to that? Maybe put a guy like me at ease, or tell me which ones, or tell the listeners what's safe with your ideas if you want to dabble yourself, and what's going to let your idea just go out to everybody.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a interesting balance. I think in general. So my philosophy from a macro perspective in general is like when you have a new business idea, I'm actually not a huge fan of stealth mode. Because I think like with a new business idea, like there's like a Mike Tyson quote, like everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Like starting a business is like that a lot of the time. Everyone thinks like, oh, I've got this great idea. It's going to use this. It's going to be like his $1 billion business. And then you show your first 10 users and you're like, this sucks, right? Like you got to do this, you got to add this, or maybe this doesn't suck, but there's like one feature in this that's interesting and you got to
Yeah.
build on top of that. So
Yeah.
from a general perspective, I think putting the idea out in the open might not be that bad. That said, there are valid reasons for stealth mode. Maybe there's proprietary technology you want to get a patent out on. Maybe there's something else like that. A couple of things you can do around that in terms of feeding it to AI. I would say that first, there are some open source AI models. I think Facebook's got like Llama. I mean, ChatGPT is owned by a company. Bard's obviously owned by Google. I think you can disable training on your data or clearing your history after a certain amount of time, which I think can help with that. And then if you don't want to feed it into that, I would suggest like there's kind of privacy focused ones that are coming out right now. I mean, I think, I think that there's the open source ones, and then there's like, you can probably find like privacy focused AI models that say like, look, we're never going to train your data. We're never going to touch your data. We're never going to store it. Like you can use this as a resource, or maybe use this product line as a resource. So, OpenAI doesn't come and kill you or something like that in 6 months with a new set of use cases.
Yeah, my biggest problem, not to take away from talking about what you do, but it's interesting for the listeners, is the ideas that I have. I've got to protect myself from $6.5 billion manufacturers that would love the idea, but I don't want to gift them the idea. I'd rather come up with the idea and white label it for everybody. So that's why I'm asking the question, and maybe off the show, maybe we'll be good enough buddies that you'll send me some ideas. But it is something that really interests me, and but I'm also I'm never nervous about it for what it's going to do in the end. I'm not a guy that thinks it's going to take over the world, unless you're going to tell me I should be worried about it. But I'm more concerned about my ideas getting stolen once they're out there.
Yeah, I think we're
So
pretty far from world domination, so I think I'm with you on that one. But I think,
yeah,
I think, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a real risk of like larger companies coming after a lot of this stuff. I think like feeding it to the AI models is pretty far from that for now. But like, yeah, privacy and security is definitely important there.
so where are some places that you've worked or interned at that you probably, in what you're doing now, kind of learned the most or took the most from, meaning as a experience to fuel what you're doing today?
Yeah, I think 2 places or 3 places probably the biggest driver to do that. First one, I guess, was way back in the day. I must have been like 17 years old. I worked at Facebook. Well, now it's Meta. Then it was Facebook. Really got
Yeah.
introduced to very high quality kind of engineering practices and processes there. Met sort of a great group of people. Really understood like how companies can kind of do this at scale and the best practices for that. And that's really helpful in kind of starting technology businesses because you are able to understand, I guess, how a high functioning business should operate. I would say that, these big tech companies, like as large as they are, like had to be very high functioning to get there. So that was one of them. The second one, I think, is kind of when I made the transition to sort of startups. Roxa was the one I worked for out of college. That was the first kind of like smaller company. It was like, yeah, like 15 to 20 people when I was there. It's much bigger now, but I was kind of one of the early people on board. That one was really interesting because I learned a lot more about kind of beyond the engineering perspective, right? So my background was primarily in engineering from kind of a younger age. And then I was like, oh, wait, there's like a lot of business stuff I got to learn too, right? I was there. I was like, this is not as simple as like, build a product and everyone's going to like beat down your door and it's going to be great. There's a lot of things around just like not only like operational things like marketing and sales and PR and stuff like that I kind of saw as a firsthand experience as they were trying to grow the company, but also like sort of soft skills like team structuring, management, like understanding like people working together in high functioning kind of effective teams, which I was able to kind of like gain some knowledge from that I then applied to sort of running Expedock. And the last place, of course, is the machine learning group at Stanford. Obviously learned a lot of the kind of technical sort of tools of the trade and artificial intelligence, kind of state of the art models there, understood how to like work through and understand cutting edge research and then apply that towards technical and business problems, which is, what I end up kind of doing with at least a good amount of my time right now.
So is there any standout that was your favorite time spent or
No, I mean, it's different, right? It's like asking to pick a favorite child or something. You learn, you learn stuff differently at each of these places. I think the time at Rockstar was pretty valuable in terms of what was most directly connected to that because it was like growing a startup, and now I'm growing a startup. So a lot of the kind of just amount of time spent, I take, I think, from learnings there. So I think like one piece of advice maybe for the listeners or otherwise is like it's not necessarily a bad idea to like work at like a really strong team at like a small early stage company before you go do your own thing, just to understand like especially maybe if you haven't had the experience before, just understand like how people run things or like how people can run things successfully. Because a lot of business, I think, is unintuitive. At least it was for me, kind of going into it, and I certainly wouldn't have been. Certainly would have made a lot more mistakes if I hadn't had kind of the background there.
so when you're not working on automation and these learning models, give me a little background on yourself. What do you like to do for fun?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So I'm a big sports guy. I'm actually a big skier, so I'm pretty excited for that. That's coming up pretty
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah, I
Which is
saw there
which
might
is
be a big snowstorm on the East Coast this weekend. So I way northeast on Thanksgiving, actually, they're saying. But
oh
you're
yeah.
West Coast anyway, so you don't care about that. I realize. But
I
anyways,
used to
continue
go to
on.
Vermont, but my family would
Did you?
probably go there. But yeah, I used to go up to Okemo, Killington, like all Vermont growing up. And then the other big thing I like to do is, so skiing, do some running sometimes, try to keep in shape. Running a company is stressful. Running businesses, you're probably sure is very stressful sometimes. So I got to
Yes.
kind of distract myself, keep myself in shape there. And then I'm a big reader as well. So recently I've been reading more kind of nonfiction type stuff, especially around kind of, well, again, it connects to work, sort of like business, automation, sort of like inflection points in industries and stuff like that. But in general, kind of generally try to read everything I get my hands on and go through phases of what I'm interested in there.
So you want to talk about your family, like background, upbringing? How are you, going into that a little?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So, I mean, my parents are, I guess, talking up with that. I moved around a lot as a kid, grew up on the East Coast mostly, kind of Lexington area, Boston, and then Connecticut. As I said, more financy type background there, I guess, where people are kind of not as much in technology. It's growing now in New York, but certainly not in Connecticut, suburban, suburban Connecticut. My parents are both doctors, although my dad decided he was more interested in business and actually went into VC for a little while after kind of being a doctor. That was kind of helpful for my background because I felt like I could, first of all, like have him as a mentor in terms of like dealing with a lot of the stuff that he's kind of seen before. And second of all, like he was able to kind of expose me to a lot of sort of business practices and stuff growing up. My mom was a doctor for a while as well, and then also decided to go into business and kind of went as an exec at some sort of drug development company doing things with like uh, she was a psychiatrist, so like mental health stuff like that. Two siblings, sisters at Berkeley, brother is at home, and I mean, I think overall, I'm definitely the most like kind of analytical one of the group. We're all very different as a family, which kind of led to some interesting conversations growing up. But yeah, I mean, I think a big part of sort of my upbringing that I'm thankful for is like obviously the exposure and kind of introduction to business, and sort of like the ability and freedom to kind of pursue what I was interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the great thing about being an entrepreneur and being in business is the freedom you do get from it. I mean, there's some stresses that come along with it, but I just think it's the most amazing thing for me to be able to see a problem and decide I'm going to solve that problem. And you can work as long in a day as you want on it or as little, but no, the problem still needs to be solved, right? So it's pretty awesome. Um, so then who do you think the most important, like, I mean, it sounds to me like your parents were probably mentors to you, but outside your parents, some mentors if you want to bring up on the show in your life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, parents obviously important mentors growing up. They've been great. I mean, I think that like there's been a lot of obviously like no one succeeds alone in a vacuum. Definitely not in business. Maybe you do if you're like hacking in your garage, but certainly
Yeah.
not in a company. Big mentors. I mean, I think that like we've had a lot of help, especially from sort of our venture investors and then kind of advisors they've introduced us to. You know, I think that Pair VC was in our seed round. They were fantastic for just getting us that 0 to 1 type phase that a lot of early stage companies go through, finding product market fit. We had Neo back us in sort of that as well. Ali Partovi has been great in terms of kind of helping us out and believing in us from sort of an early stage. And then we recently kind of got around from Insight Partners. Those guys are awesome because they're sort of much better for kind of later stage and growth stage type businesses. So they've introduced us to sort of tons of mentors around like how do you grow this business? How do you scale this? Like, how do you, kind of like set up and structure a sales team? Like, what are the best practices? What should growth look like right now? And then I think like in terms of a personal side of things, I mean, I've had a lot of kind of direct engineering mentors. My professors in college obviously have been good. I've had some old bosses who have been great. And like now we have kind of like angel investors and stuff like that in our business who are willing to, spend their time trying to help me out, which is awesome because they're very busy, obviously, and have been pretty helpful in terms of like immediate kind of success on things.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I think it's great that you had an opportunity to kind of mention some of those VCs. Yeah, I'm always concerned. I'm at the point in my company where I've got to make a decision if I, take on some capital or franchise or something. Like I said, it's kind of different space, but that's one of the things for me. If you work with some of the VCs, there's a lot of people that have done business and they can help you kind of go to the next phase. Um, but then again, too, like for me with franchising, I get a bunch of entrepreneur type personalities that I can learn from as much as being their teacher. I can learn from them. So, and that's the thing about it. Like you said, no one's doing it by themselves. It's a cumulative. Um, so yeah, so that's great. So, what got you? By the way, so you said you're into sports. So skiing. Anything else other than that? I mean, that's kind of what your favorite is, because obviously you can't ski all the time. So what are you doing when you're
No,
not
I
skiing?
cannot. I wish I could, but unfortunately, I can't. I got to run a company too. I also actually did track when I was in high school. I competed at like a kind of regional level there, so that was fun. As I said, I did some running, kind of do that a little bit, kind of just more for my own health at this point. And then I played squash for a while. Actually, big East Coast thing, I guess. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people
What?
are
Okay.
into
So
that, but
what's? Well, I don't know
yeah.
what that is. What is
Oh,
it?
it's racquetball. It's like racquetball.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's like it's pretty much like racquetball with like a slightly different court and setup and stuff. I played that in high school. I'm not like a serious athlete about it or anything like that, but it's good to kind of keep in shape and it's a fun skill game.
So what's probably your favorite thing, about being an entrepreneur and doing what you're doing? Uh, what? I guess at the end of the day, what's your favorite thing you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing that you said earlier before kind of really spoke to me about being an entrepreneur, right? A big part of it is just being your own boss. It's not. I mean, on being an entrepreneur is, I think someone who hasn't done it doesn't always understand. Like, it's a very tough life in a lot of ways, right? Like the buck stops with you always, and that's difficult
Yes.
sometimes. But the flip side of that is like it's very rewarding, right? You get to be your own boss. Like you get to say like, okay, I'm going to solve these problems. I'm going to work on what I want to work on, right? Like no one else is going to tell me what to do except myself, and like I only have kind of myself to look at here, which is great. And then the other thing that's rewarding to me is just honestly like solving the types of problems that have like a large impact on the world, right? Like it's what I want to do with my time. Like I find it rewarding. It gets me out of bed if I'm like, okay, I'm going to get up today and like I know that there's going to be problems in this business, and I know that there's going to be things I have to kind of solve. But like it's really rewarding to me to be able to spend my time working on something that can like, I mean, in our business's case, I believe have impact to millions of people worldwide if we're able to solve these supply chain problems, and that is sort of something that's I think a really big kind of reward function for what I do.
Yeah, we share a similar feel on that. I think for me too, it's about, and I want to see if you feel the same way. Like as I grow, I have like 200 people that work for me in one of my businesses, in my landscape company, and I actually just said work for me, work with me. They're part of my team, and the bigger that team gets, it's like I have an extended family. It's like my work family. And I just look at the opportunity because not everybody's like a you and I, right? There's a lot of people that don't want the buck to stop with them. I mean, there's people that can't
Yeah,
even
sure.
decide what they want for dinner at night. So and so it's like that is part of what fuels me also is not only solving the problems, but bringing people along for the ride with me so we can do it together. And do you feel the same way about that?
I do. I think it's the right people, right? So small caveat there. I think that in terms of like not only doing it with you, but also like helping everyone in the business grow, right? I mean, we have like 100 plus employees, and like a big part of that is like getting the best people on board who are really excited. I mean, if you get great people on board who are smart, who are fun to work with, and like who are excited about the same problem space, like it's super rewarding too, right? It's like okay, we're all going to grow this together. Everyone's got a really heavy kind of buy-in on the mission and the vision, and like we're all sort of like A players and executors, and that's something that's really great because I've worked at sort of, I mean, I've worked at, teams or companies or in school projects or whatever, where not everyone's an A player. And, that gets kind of frustrating. But if you're able to build
Yeah,
kind of the team that you want and people are bought in and excited about it, there's no better group of people to work with.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's why technology exists, though, right? What you just said, like at the end of the day, not everyone's an A player, and sometimes I think the people that pull for the technology the most are the people that feel as if they're pulling people that don't want to work in the first place along. Um, so in the end of the day, those people kind of fuel the technology. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that like, especially in business, like at the earlier stages where you're not like this massive, behemoth, I think it's like, okay, look, if you don't want to be here, pull this mission along, like don't work here, right? I think, and then I think like for technology in general, I think especially with automation, like, yeah, that's a big part of it, right? Where it's like, okay, if people aren't A players or something like that, they can kind of be helped out with this. And then another part of it is again, what we talked about before around like, well, maybe this person's like an A player in this type of field, but they're spending a lot of their time like in automation or on this other work that's kind of demotivating or kind of like, not sort of what their core competency is. And like being able to use technology to kind of unlock the potential in people, I think is a big part of sort of success of adopting tech in general.
Yeah. So you said earlier that me asking you what your favorite place was like picking your favorite kids. Do you have any kids yet, or are you assuming
No,
that's how
no,
that
no
feels?
kids.
No kids.
not
Yeah.
not for a while for me. Still
Uh,
still relatively fresh out of college.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look like a pretty young guy, but you never want to assume, right? So I figured I'd ask the question. Um, so, I think that you obviously are a pretty young guy. So, I mean, do you think for you with what you're doing, I mean, is this your final destination, or is this, you're going to keep growing it until you're someplace else? Like, where do you see yourself in the future?
A good question. So, I mean, I think in terms of like a general framework for my future, I want to be working on the problems that impact sort of the most number of people in a positive way, right? And I think that like this is definitely one of those problems where if if we keep growing and we keep scaling and we are able to solve these really impactful problems that help a lot of people, then I would be happy to spend as long as I need to here, right? Like it's what I want to do with my time. If that were to ever stop, that's probably when I would say like, okay, maybe this isn't for me anymore. We've achieved some level of success and like it's not scaling or it's not growing. But I think like in general, it's more in the former camp right now. Certainly excited to kind of continue growing it as it is and hopefully just scale from there.
Yeah. Um, so trying to think how to word this because a lot of people that are on the show, they're uh they're a lot farther along in their business career. And I usually have a what do you want your legacy question to be? Um, so might seem a little strange when I ask the question, but I don't want to be unfair or not ask the question either. So, at the end of the day, what is it? What do you want to be remembered by today? Because if I have you on the show 5 years from now, maybe it'll change. But today, what is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the biggest things that I want to be remembered by are, I think, just I want to be able to build technology that can, again, and positively impact sort of the most number of people in the world as humanly possible, right? So I think that like I want to be remembered for having built sort of great software systems, great pieces of technology that have sort of solved large problems in business or in commerce or in the world. And that enough people kind of know about and understand that like it's a sort of major kind of fundamental advancement relative to how sort of things were done before. I think like that if I'm able to kind of impact as many people as possible, sort of with my work and with the time and technology that I build, then that would generally be successful in terms of like what I think my legacy would want to be, I guess.
Well, I think that's a fantastic goal, and I think you're well on your way. Um, I want to thank you for being on the show today. I hope you share it to your network. I will definitely be sharing a lot of this out. I'm fascinated in the work that you do. I think that the world needs people like you. I think that uh, there's more work to be done than can be handled. efficiently. And someone like you makes the world function much more efficiently. So I thank you for that.
I try my
Um,
best.
yeah. And with that, I think this is going to conclude this episode of Automating Success. I want to thank you for being on the show, and uh, I hope you enjoyed yourself.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.